Hello, my name is Valeria. This is my new original story on my channel. Subscribe and enjoy.
The Alpha King ordered her execution. He didn't know she was already carrying his heir. The execution order carried no name. It never did. When you were taken from a destroyed border settlement and thrown into the royal dungeons as a suspected spy, you did not get a name. You got a number, a cell, a date. Elara's date was written in the Alpha King's own hand, on a document she would never see. She had been in the dark long enough to stop counting days by light. The torches in the corridor beyond her iron door burned at the same low flicker, whether it was noon or midnight. Time had collapsed into a single, endless stretch of cold stone, and silence broken only by the sound of boots on the floor above, and the distant howling of wolves she could not see. She was not afraid. That surprised her, in the quiet hours when there was nothing to do but notice things about herself. She had expected fear. She'd been raised in a clan that spoke of royal dungeons, the way people spoke of death. Inevitable, final, not to be survived. She had prepared herself for the trembling, for the desperate prayers, for the bargaining with whatever power might be listening in the dark. It had not come. What had come instead was something quieter and harder to name, a kind of stillness, like the moment after a storm when the air holds its breath and the world waits. She sat with her back against the cold stone wall, and one hand resting, almost without thinking, against the flat plane of her stomach. And she waited. Chapter 1. The dungeons beneath Arkenfall Palace smelled of iron and old water, and something faintly animal that never quite left the stone, no matter how many years passed. Elara had been in her cell for what she estimated was 11 days when the old guard came. She knew he was old by the sound of his walk. The younger ones moved quickly, their boots sharp and certain on the corridor floor. This one moved the way someone moved when each step required a quiet negotiation with pain. Slow, deliberate, the kind of walk that had learned patience the hard way. He appeared at her door and looked at her through the narrow iron bars, and something in his face changed. Not much, but enough that she noticed. She had been sitting cross-legged on the stone floor with her hair loose and her hands folded in her lap, and she watched him look at her the way she had learned to watch everything in this place, with the careful stillness of someone who understood that attention, properly focused, was the only tool she had left. He was looking at her neck. Elara did not move. She did not reach up to cover the mark that sat in the hollow of her throat just below her collarbone. She had spent most of her life covering it. Old habit. But in the dungeons there had seemed little point, and she had grown careless. The guard's face had gone a shade paler. His name was Aldrich. She had worked this out by listening to the other guards address him, which was something they did with slightly more deference than rank alone would explain. The particular deference of people who had known a man a very long time, and still could not quite shake what he had once been. He stared at the mark for a long moment. The crescent, the double curve, the old bloodline sign that had not appeared on a living person in 3 generations, or so the stories said. Then he looked at her face. Then he turned and walked away without a word. Elara let out a slow breath. She did not know what he had seen, or what he would do with it. She knew only that something had shifted. The kind of shift you felt before a storm, when the air pressure changed, and the birds went quiet, and the world tilted on its axis just slightly. She rested her hand against her stomach again. The child was not yet showing. It would not show for another few weeks, she thought. She was not skilled enough in such things to be precise. She only knew what her body had been telling her quietly and with increasing insistence for the past 2 months. And she had learned to trust her body above most other things. She had not told anyone. There was no one to tell. She closed her eyes and thought, not for the first time, of the man whose child she was carrying. She did not know his name. She knew his face. She knew his hands. She knew the exact quality of his voice when he was half conscious and in pain, the way it had been rough and deep and strangely grateful. She knew the weight of him when she had dragged him from the ruins of the collapsed trading post, one beam at a time, her shoulders screaming and the storm howling around her like a living thing. She knew the way he had looked at her when he woke and found her crouched beside the fire she had built from the wreckage, warming water in her only pot. She did not know that he was the Alpha King of Arkenfall. She had not known until they brought her here. She had understood many things in the moment they had thrown her into this cell. The quality of the stone, the size of the dungeon, the armor on the guards. She had understood that she had stumbled into something larger than she had any hope of navigating. She had understood that the man whose name she still did not know had a throne behind him. She had understood, most importantly, that telling anyone about that night would not save her. It would only make things worse. A woman who claimed to have slept with the Alpha King was not a prisoner to be released. She was a problem to be made very, very quiet. So she had said nothing. She had given them no name, no clan, but the one they already knew was gone. No information that could be verified or used against her. She had sat in the dark and been still and waited to see what would happen next. What had happened next was Aldrich. Aldrich, who had looked at the mark on her throat with the face of a man seeing a ghost. Chapter 2. King Cain of Arkenfall signed 43 documents before the morning meal. He had learned to do this without reading most of them. Not out of carelessness, which would have surprised the people who feared him, but out of a particular efficiency of attention. He had read every type of document that crossed his desk so many times that the categories had sorted themselves into clear signals in his mind. Treaty amendments required full attention. Supply requisitions required none. Execution orders for border spies fell somewhere in the middle. Enough awareness to note the crime, the evidence summary, the recommendation from the dungeon master. He noted. He signed. He moved on. He did not note names because border spies taken without identification were logged by number, and the numbers meant nothing to him beyond their place in the larger count of threats neutralized in a given month. The 43rd document of the morning was a death warrant for prisoner number 112. Suspected intelligence courier for the Ashvin network. No identification. No cooperating testimony. Detained 11 days without producing actionable information. Standard. He signed it without ceremony and set it on the stack to his left and reached for his tea and forgot about it immediately. He had a full morning of court proceedings and a delegation from the eastern provinces arriving before noon, and 3 ongoing territorial disputes that required his personal attention. He did not think about prisoner 112 again. Not until later. Not until the morning of the execution, when he went to the public square, the way he went to all public executions. Not because he enjoyed it, but because he had learned, early in his reign, that a king who ordered deaths but could not bear to witness them, was a king whose conscience was still divided, and a divided conscience was a weakness he could not afford. He stood on the stone platform above the square in his black cloak, with the wind cutting cold from the north, and watched the prisoners brought out. 112 was the last. She walked. That was the first thing he noticed, because most of them had to be carried or half-dragged at this point, and this one walked on her own, upright, her chin level. Her hands were bound in front of her, and her dark hair was loose, and the morning light caught it as she came through the gate into the square. She was young, not a girl, but young, mid-20s perhaps. She stopped at the mark, and the executioner took his position, and the court herald began to read the charge, and Cain was watching her face, because that was what he always watched. The face was where you saw the truth of what a person was, in those last moments when there was nothing left to perform for. She was not crying. She was not praying. She was looking at something he could not see. No, not something. Somewhere. Her eyes were focused on a middle distance that had nothing to do with the square or the crowd or the sword that was about to end her life. She was somewhere else entirely, and the expression on her face was not peace exactly, and it was not resignation exactly, and it was not the blank absence of shock. It was the expression of someone who had already made a decision. He could not say, afterward, why that disturbed him. He had watched hundreds of executions. He had seen every variety of last expression a human face could produce. There was nothing technically remarkable about this one, but something in him went very still. His wolf, which had been half asleep in the comfortable background space it occupied during public proceedings, stirred. Cain frowned slightly. He kept his expression neutral, as he always did, but inwardly he gave the stirring a small, questioning attention. His wolf did not respond with anything intelligible. It simply stayed awake, present, alert in a way. It was not usually alert at executions. The herald finished reading. The executioner raised the sword, and then the wind changed. It came from the north, the same direction as before, but something in it shifted, the way wind shifted over open water when the current beneath moved. It carried cold and ice, and the thin, clean smell of the high mountain passes. And underneath that was something else. Cain went rigid. He did not move. He could not move. He stood completely still on the platform, while the sword was already at its apex, and the crowd was already holding its breath, and everything in him turned over with the sudden, blunt certainty of a key in a lock. He knew that scent. He knew it the way he knew the scent of his own skin after a long run, the way you knew the things that had worked their way into your memory, below the level of thought. He had carried it with him for 3 months, without understanding what it was, the way you carried a song you could not name, but could not stop hearing. The collapsed trading post on the Greyford border road. The storm so severe that even he, with all his strength, had not been able to dig himself out alone. The beam that had caught him across the back, with enough force to crack something that had needed time and quiet to mend. The darkness, and then the firelight, and then hands, careful, strong, unhurried hands, working the debris away from him piece by piece. A girl, alone, in the worst storm of the year, without a wolf, with no reason to stop and every reason to keep moving, who had stopped anyway, who had stayed through the night, who had been gone by the time he woke in the morning with his wounds cleaned and the fire still burning, and the storm past, and no trace of her, but the warmth she had left in the air. He had looked for her. He was not proud of how hard he had looked. He had sent men to the Greyford area twice, asking after a young, dark-haired woman traveling alone. No one had seen her, or no one had said. The border settlements were that kind of quiet when it came to strangers. A learned quiet, a protective quiet. He had stopped looking after the second month because a king had other things to do, and the absence of a woman he had known for one night should not have occupied his attention the way it did. But the scent. He had never forgotten the scent. And it was here. It was her. Stop. The word came out of him before the thought completed. He did not shout it. He did not need to shout. His voice, at its ordinary volume, carried authority that 11 years of ruling had made absolute, and it fell across the square, like a stone into water, rippling out in a sudden silence that swallowed even the wind. The executioner stopped. The sword came down from its arc. Slowly. The man looked up at the platform with wide eyes. The court herald looked up. The crowd looked up. Every face in the square turned toward him, and Cain felt the weight of all that attention, and gave it nothing. His eyes were on her. She had not flinched when the sword stopped. She had not gasped. She had not collapsed with relief or wept, or done any of the things people did when death stopped an inch away from them. She had turned her head. She was looking at him now, and he saw her face clearly for the first time, and the wolf in him went absolutely silent in the particular way that meant something mattered. Not just known, not just remembered, mattered. If you have been waiting to see what happens next, stay with us. The story is only beginning, and the secret she is carrying will change everything. Chapter 3. The entire square was holding its breath. Elara looked at the man on the platform. She had not been looking at him before. She had trained her eyes on something past all of them, a habit she had developed in the first days of her imprisonment, when the guards had wanted reactions from her, and she had learned that taking her attention somewhere else entirely was the only way to deny them what they wanted. She had perfected it until it was almost real, almost like actually being somewhere else, somewhere that was not the square, and the sword, and the cold morning air. But the voice had pulled her back. She had heard it before. She had heard it in the darkness of a storm, rough and pain-fogged and grateful, in a way that powerful men rarely were, as if gratitude was something he did not usually allow himself, and the pain had stripped away whatever usually held it in check. She had heard it say thank you, in a voice so low it was almost only breath, and she had thought, at the time, that it was the voice of a man who meant it. She looked at him now. He was taller than she remembered, or perhaps the platform added height. He was dressed in black, a long cloak over armor she could see the edge of at his collar, and his face was precisely as she remembered it. Severe, angular, the kind of face that looked as if it had been built for function rather than appeal, and had achieved appeal incidentally. Dark eyes that were, at this moment, doing something she had not expected. They were seeing her, not looking at her in the way the guards had looked at her, cataloging and assessing. Not in the way the court had looked at her as she crossed the square, briefly curious about which prisoner this was before returning to their own thoughts. He was seeing her, and she saw, in the fractional shift of his expression, too small for anyone further than 10 paces to catch, but she was trained in the small movements of people who controlled their faces, something she had not expected at all. Recognition, Her stomach turned over. She had told herself he would not know her. She had told herself this so many times and so firmly that she had almost made herself believe it. She had changed since the storm. She had lost weight in the dungeons. Her hair was different. The circumstances were so wildly different. A border road in a blizzard versus a royal execution square, that no one could be expected to bridge the distance. But he was a wolf. She had forgotten that. Or not forgotten, set aside. She had set aside the fact that wolves did not forget scents the way humans forgot faces. She had been very stupid. Bring her to me. His voice again. Quiet. Absolute. 2 of the royal guards were moving before the sentence finished, crossing the square toward her, and the crowd was already beginning the low, uncertain murmur of people who had expected one thing and were receiving something entirely different, and did not yet know what to make of it. Elara thought, very quickly, about running. She dismissed it. Her hands were bound, and there were 100 guards in the square, and she was inside the palace walls, and even if none of that had been true, she was 2 months pregnant and slightly dizzy in the mornings, and running was probably not her best option. She stood still and let the guards come to her. They were not rough. That surprised her. They flanked her and walked her back across the square and up the stone steps to the platform, and the crowd parted around them and made a sound like a held breath, and no one spoke. She stopped 6 feet from him. He was looking at her neck. Her hand moved before she caught it, the old reflex, the long habit of covering the mark. She stopped herself, let her hands, still bound, fall back to her sides. His gaze moved from the mark to her face. She met his eyes and said nothing. "What is your name?" It was not a question. He said it the way he said everything else. A flat quiet that expected compliance as a matter of course. She considered her options, which were limited. He had already stopped her execution. Whatever he knew or suspected, he had shown his hand to a public square, rather than let her die, which meant something. She was not sure yet what it meant, but it was something, and she had learned that something was always better than nothing. "Elara," she said. His expression did not change. "From where?" "The Ashven border settlements," she said. "The Greyford region specifically, though there is not much left of it now." Something moved across his face at the word Greyford. The smallest tightening around the eyes. Almost nothing. "Leave us." The herald and the attendants exchanged glances. This was not protocol. This was so far outside protocol that it had left protocol's borders and entered entirely unmapped territory. But they knew what his voice sounded like when the decision was made, and they went. The guards remained. He looked at the nearest one. Beyond earshot. The guard moved. They were alone on the platform, as alone as 2 people could be in a square, still full of silent, watching courtiers and soldiers, who were too far away now to hear, but very definitely not too far away to see. Cain looked at her for a long moment. She looked back. "How long?" he said. She did not pretend to misunderstand him. She had told herself she would not tell him. She had made this decision over and over in the dark of her cell, reinforcing it, building it up like a wall. She had been very certain of it. Looking at him now, she found that the wall was still there. But there was a crack in it. 3 months, she said. Something happened to his face that she could not fully read. It moved through several things very quickly, none of them anything she had expected, and then settled into something that was very controlled, but not, she thought, controlled enough to be entirely cold. He said, very quietly, "You should have told them when they took you." "Told them what?" she said. "That the prisoner they took from a destroyed clan outpost was carrying the king's child. I would have been executed faster." "No," he said, and something in his voice made her look at him more carefully. "You would not have been. You did not know who I was." "No," he said, "I did not." A silence. "You left before I woke," he said, and there was something underneath the flat evenness of it that she heard despite herself. "You were alive, and the storm had passed," she said. "You did not need me any more. I looked for you." She had not expected that. She had constructed a very clear picture of how that night had existed in his memory. A small episode. A rough night in a border storm. A woman he had been grateful to in the moment and forgotten within the week. She had needed that picture to be true. She had relied on it. He watched her process it. She thought he was probably very good at reading faces. He would have had a lot of practice. "Why did you say nothing when they brought you in?" he said. "In 11 days. "I told you why. You were protecting yourself." "I was being practical," she said. "There is a difference." "Is there?" She looked at him steadily. "A woman who comes in from a destroyed settlement, carrying a story about the Alpha King, is not believed. She is made to disappear quietly. You know that as well as I do." He was quiet for a moment. "The mark on your throat," he said. "Where did you get it?" "I was born with it." Another silence. She watched him decide something. "Come with me," he said. "My hands are still bound," she said. He looked at her bound wrists, reached down, not calling a guard, not making a production of it, and undid the rope himself with efficient fingers. It fell to the platform. She looked at her own hands, as if she had forgotten they were part of her. "Come with me," he said again. She followed him off the platform, and she did not look at the crowd as they went. But she could feel the weight of their attention like a physical pressure at her back, and she knew that whatever had just happened in the square, it was not going to be easily explained or quietly forgotten. She was not sure anymore what she had wanted from this moment. She was not sure, in fact, that she had ever really believed she would survive, to have a moment to want anything from. She kept her hand loose at her side, and did not let it drift to her stomach, though every instinct told it to. Not yet. Not in front of all these watching eyes. Not until she understood what she had walked into. Chapter 4. He took her to a room she later learned was called the Stone Antechamber, which had exactly the warmth the name suggested. It was a functional space. Stone walls, a fire that had been recently built up, a long table, 2 chairs. No decorations, no softness. The kind of room where things got decided without ceremony. He sat across from her at the table, with his hands flat on the surface, and looked at her the way she imagined he looked at treaty documents, with the complete attention of someone who was not going to let a single word go unprocessed. She sat across from him and looked back. "Tell me everything," he said, "from the beginning, from before the storm." She had not spoken at length to anyone in 11 days. Her voice came out slightly rough at first, and she cleared her throat, which felt like the most embarrassingly human thing to do in front of an Alpha King, and began. She told him about the settlement. The Ashvin border clans were a loose network of shifter families that had occupied the Greyford Highlands for generations, surviving in the space between the major packs by being useful to everyone and owing formal allegiance to none. Healers, Traders. People who knew the mountain passes and the border roads, and could move between territories in ways that larger groups could not. She had been a runner for her family's trading post. She knew the roads from the northern coast to the southern forests. She had been running goods across the border for 6 years, and had never been stopped, never been questioned, never been anything other than exactly what she appeared to be, which was a young woman with a pack and a reliable sense of direction. The trouble had started 4 months ago. She explained the trouble carefully. The Ashvin network had been used, without the knowledge of most of its members, including her, by a faction within the network who had been passing information to a rival coalition. When Arkenfall's border enforcement had finally identified the leak, they had moved fast and broadly, and the settlements that had been closest to the road network, the ones most useful to the information runners, had been the first to go. Her settlement had burned on a Tuesday. She had been on the road when it happened. She had come back to smoke and silence and nothing recognizable. She had packed what she could carry, which was not much, and she had kept moving because stopping was not something she knew how to do. 3 weeks later, the storm. She said this plainly and without embellishment, and watched him listen. He was very good at listening. He did not interrupt. He did not react visibly to the things she said. He simply took it in, and she had the sense of information being sorted and filed behind those dark eyes, with the same efficiency she imagined he brought to everything else. She came to the storm. The trading post had been a stone structure, one of the old way station buildings that the border roads were dotted with, and she had been sheltering in it for 2 days, waiting for the weather to break, when the second wall had given way, under the weight of accumulated ice. It had come down suddenly and badly, and she had been across the room when it happened, which was the only reason she had not been buried with it. The man had been at the center of it. She did not know, even now, how he had come to be there. She had not asked him. It had not seemed like the kind of question you asked someone you had just dug out of the rubble. She had concentrated on the practical, the debris, the injuries, the cold, the fire, and she had let him sleep, and she had kept watch, and in the morning she had made her assessment, which was that he was stable and breathing, and that 2 people in a way station, in a receding storm, was 1 person too many for her particular situation. She had left. She said this last part evenly, and looked at him and waited. "You left," he said. "I left," she confirmed, "knowing you might be pregnant." "Not knowing," she said, "suspecting. It became more certain later, and you decided not to come forward." "I decided to get south," she said. "I had no clan left. I had no resources. A pregnancy on the road was not something I could manage alone, and I was trying to reach a contact in the valley settlements who might have helped me. I was picked up by border patrols 3 days before I got there." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You knew, when they brought you here, who I was." "Not immediately. By the 2nd day. And you still said nothing." "I was not going to use your child as leverage," she said, and her voice came out harder than she had intended. "I was not going to say, 'Here, I have something you want. Let me make a bargain.' That is not who I am." "It might have kept you alive." "I did not know that. I only knew what it would have looked like to anyone who heard it, and I was not willing to be that woman." He looked at her for a long moment. She could not tell what he was thinking. She had been good at reading faces all her life, and she could not read his, which was unusual and vaguely unnerving. She had the sense of great depth behind the stillness, the way a lake looked flat and quiet from the surface and went down a very long way. "The mark," he said. She touched the hollow of her throat without thinking. "Where did you really get it?" he said. Not an accusation, an honest question, which was somehow worse. "I told you," she said. "I was born with it. The crescent blood mark has not appeared on a living person in 3 generations, he said. It is the mark of the Arkenfall founding line, the bloodline of the first Alpha King of this territory, which was considered extinct." She said nothing. "You know what it is," he said. "I suspected," she said quietly. "I knew it was old. I knew it was the kind of thing that made people look at me strangely when they saw it. I covered it for most of my life. I stopped covering it in the dungeons because it seemed pointless." "It is not pointless," he said. "It is the reason one of my guards came to me this morning before your execution and asked me to delay it." She stared at him. Aldrich. He would not tell me why. He said only that I should see her face. I did not understand what he meant until I was in the square and the wind changed. A long silence. "What does it mean?" she said. "Not about the mark specifically. About all of it." He looked at her with that dark, unreadable gaze. "It means," he said, "that we have a great deal to discuss." She looked around the cold, functional room with its fire, and its 2 chairs, and its complete absence of any comfort. "All right," she said. She was still not afraid. She was something else now, something she did not quite have a name for. Not hope, which was too clean and too familiar a word. Something more complicated. Something that felt like the moment before a storm, when the air changed, and everything that had been settled suddenly became uncertain again. Something that felt like the beginning of a different story than the one she had been writing in her head for the last 11 days. She sat in her chair, across from the Alpha King of Arkenfall, who had signed her death warrant without knowing her name, and she did not let her hand go to her stomach, and she waited to see what the next sentence of this new story would be. Chapter 5. They were in the stone antechamber for 2 hours. He did not send for advisers or scribes. He did not call his counsel. He asked her questions, and she answered them, and he asked more questions, and she answered those, and slowly the picture built itself on the table, between them like a map of a territory that had not been charted before. She asked him questions too. She had decided, somewhere in the first half hour, that the careful holding back was no longer serving her, and that if this was going to go anywhere at all, she needed information as much as he did. How had he come to be in the way station? He had been riding alone, something he did occasionally, with and occasionally without a guard rotation, to clear his head in the border territories he did not often visit in official capacity. He had been caught in the storm the same as her, and had taken shelter the same as her, and the wall had come down with no warning. He did not say what he had been thinking about when he rode alone into a storm. She did not ask. She asked him about Aldrich. The old guard, he said, had served the palace for 40 years, had served his father before him, was one of the few people in the palace whose memory reached back to the old stories, the founding histories, the bloodmark, and what it meant. "What does it mean?" she said. "Specifically." He looked at her carefully. "You are not afraid to know." "I have been sitting in a dungeon cell for 11 days, waiting to be executed," she said. "I used up most of my fear reserves in the first 2 days. At this point, I would like information." Something moved across his face that she could not quite identify. She thought, very distantly, that it might be the beginning of something that could eventually become amusement. It was hard to tell. He seemed like a man for whom amusement was a language he had learned theoretically, but did not speak fluently. The bloodmark, he said, was the mark of the first Alpha King's line, the direct bloodline. It passed through his children and his grandchildren, and then, 3 generations back, the last known bearer died without heir, and the mark was considered ended. I am clearly not from 3 generations ago, she said. No, he said, which means either the line did not end when we thought it did, or it ended and restarted, which is not something we believed possible, or the stories we have been telling about the bloodmark are not as complete as we believed. She was quiet for a moment. Does it change anything, practically? He looked at her with those dark eyes that did not give away enough. It changes a great deal, he said, practically. She wanted to ask what. She had the sense that she was not going to get a complete answer yet, and that pushing for one would be counterproductive. She had learned patience in the dungeons, if nothing else. You said you were trying to reach the valley settlements, he said. A contact. A woman named Seren. She was a midwife and a healer. She had helped my clan before. Is she still there? Elara blinked. The question had been practical, immediate, oriented toward a future she had not allowed herself to think about for 11 days. I do not know, she said carefully. I assume so. We can find out. She looked at him. The fire was burning lower now, and the room was slightly warmer than it had been at the start, and his face in the changing light was very carefully controlled but not entirely, and she was starting to be able to read some of the things it was doing that the control did not quite reach. He was working something out. He was working something out, the way a general worked out terrain before a campaign, methodically, comprehensively, without rushing, building toward a plan that would not have gaps. She did not yet know what the plan was. She knew only that it included a midwife, which meant he was thinking about the child, and that he had stopped her execution and asked her questions for 2 hours, instead of delegating any of this to anyone else. That told her something. She was not sure yet how to weigh it. There will be questions, she said. Yes, he said, from the court, the council, everyone who was in that square this morning. Yes. What do you intend to tell them? He looked at her for a moment. The truth, he said. Eventually. She raised her eyebrows slightly. Eventually is a very flexible word, she said. It is, he agreed. And there it was again, that almost not quite amusement, gone so quickly she could not be sure she had seen it. It is also a precise one. There are things that need to be in place before the truth will not be actively dangerous to you. To you. Not to us. Not to the arrangement. Not to the political situation. To you. She noticed that. She noticed it, and said it very carefully in a mental space, and told herself not to make too much of it. I will need chambers, she said. Not the dungeon. Obviously, he said. And I will need access to food that is not the dungeon provisions, which were frankly offensive. The corner of his mouth moved, just slightly. So slightly she would have missed it if she had been looking anywhere else. I will speak to the kitchens, he said. She nodded, looked at the fire, thought about everything she had not said, and everything she had, and everything that was still to be navigated between them, which was a very large territory indeed, with no map and no existing paths. You should know, she said, without looking at him, that I am not going to tell anyone unless I choose to. I am not going to use this as a position. I am not going to make demands beyond reasonable comfort and access to a midwife. I am telling you this not to negotiate, but because I think you should know what kind of person I am, and you cannot know that from 11 days of dungeon records. A silence. I know what kind of person you are, he said quietly. She looked at him then. He was looking at the fire. You dragged a man twice your size out of the ruins of a building in a blizzard, he said, and cleaned his wounds, and kept the fire burning, and were gone before he could put you in a position that complicated things for you. That is a person who acts from conscience, rather than calculation. She said nothing. I have not forgotten that night, he said. I did not forget it, when it was convenient to forget it. The fire shifted in its grate. Outside, somewhere in the palace, she heard the distant sound of boots on stone, the ordinary machinery of a large place going about its day. Neither did I, she said, and for a moment, in the cold, functional room with its insufficient fire and its 2 chairs, they sat with that between them, which was not nothing, and which was not yet anything definable, and which was, for now, enough. Chapter 6. Word spread through the palace the way it always did, faster than was physically possible, through channels that had no official name and left no official trail. By nightfall, everyone who worked in the palace knew that the execution had been stopped. By the following morning, they knew that a prisoner had been brought up from the dungeons and installed in the East Wing guest chambers, which were used exclusively for people the king considered significant enough to house personally. By the morning after that, they knew the prisoner was young and dark-haired, and had been in the square in execution whites, and had walked with the Alpha King through the palace corridors, without guards and without restraints. They did not know much more than that, which meant the speculation engine of the palace was running on pure fuel. Elara heard most of it from Marta. Marta was the woman assigned to her chambers, a middle-aged palace servant with a face like a walnut and eyes that missed nothing, who had apparently decided, on some basis Elara could not identify, that her situation was acceptable and therefore deserved service with a professional thoroughness that did not include any of the personal distancing the other servants were practicing. They are saying you are a spy, Marta said, on the first morning, laying out breakfast with the efficiency of a woman who had been doing this for decades. I was accused of being a spy, Elara said carefully. There is a difference. They are also saying you are a witch. That is less accurate. And that you know where the Ashvin Network's courier routes run, and the king is keeping you alive for the information. Elara looked at her breakfast, which was exceptional compared to 11 days of dungeon provisions, and was possibly the best thing she had seen in months. What do you think? She said. Marta considered her with those sharp eyes. I think, she said, that the king looked at you in that square, the way he has not looked at anything in a very long time, and that this is more interesting than spy routes. Elara said nothing. She ate her breakfast. Also, Marta added, adjusting the curtains with an air of total professional detachment, you are with child. Elara set down her cup. She had not told anyone. She had been careful. She was not yet showing. I am a palace servant of 40 years, Marta said without looking at her. I have seen every variety of pregnancy in this palace, early and late, wanted and otherwise. You are approximately 2 months along. You are trying very hard not to let your hand go to your stomach, and you have asked for plain food instead of the spiced options, because the spices make you ill. I am not a dunce." A pause. "I will not tell anyone," Marta said simply. "That is not my business to tell. But I thought you should know that you are not as unreadable as you think you are. Not to someone paying close attention." Elara looked at her for a long moment. "Thank you," she said quietly. Marta nodded, adjusted the last curtain, and left with the air of someone who had said everything that needed saying and had no interest in saying more. Elara sat alone with her breakfast and the morning light coming through the east window, and thought about the mark on her throat and the child she was carrying and the man who had signed her death warrant without knowing her name. She thought about the way he had said, "I have not forgotten that night." She thought about a great many things, and came to no particular conclusions, which was probably the correct response to a situation that had not yet finished constructing itself. She ate her breakfast. It was very good. She kept her hand in her lap. Chapter 7. The council met 3 days later. Cain had prepared for this, the way he prepared for everything complicated, methodically, without sentiment, with a clear picture of every argument that would be made against him, and how he intended to address each one. The council chamber held 8 men and 2 women, all of them experienced in the particular way that palace advisors became experienced, which was to say, they had seen a great deal and been surprised by very little, and developed strong opinions about what was proper and what was not. Lord Heward was the first to speak. He was the oldest member of the council, and had been advising Cain's father before him, which he considered a credential, and Cain considered a complication. "With respect, Your Majesty," Heward said, "the court requires an explanation." "I am aware," Cain said, "a prisoner, a convicted spy, taken from the execution and installed in the East Wing." "Accused spy," Cain said, "not convicted. There is a difference." Heward's face performed the expression of a man who considered this distinction technical. "The order was signed," he said. "The order was signed without adequate review of the evidence," Cain said. "I reviewed it subsequently. The evidence is insufficient for execution." This was technically true. He had reviewed it subsequently. He had also found it insufficient, though not for the reasons he had initially been examining it. The dungeon master's summary had been thin. A woman from a known courier settlement, no cooperating testimony, no material evidence of espionage activity, detained on proximity rather than proof. It had been thin because the evidence was thin. She was not a spy. He was certain of this, and not only because he wanted to be. "The bloodmark," said Lady Voss, from the far end of the table. She was the youngest member of the council, and the most dangerous thinker in the room, which Cain appreciated more often than it was comfortable. "Yes," he said. "Aldrich confirmed it?" "Aldrich was the one who brought it to my attention." A silence around the table. "If the bloodmark is authentic," Voss said carefully, "then we have a significant historical question on our hands. The founding bloodline was believed to have ended. If it has not, it has not," Cain said. "The implications are complex. Yes," Heward cleared his throat. "The woman's identity. She is from the Ashfin border settlements, the Greyford region, a border settlement woman with the founding bloodmark. The bloodmark does not select for territory of residence," Cain said. "If the line continued, it continued wherever it continued. bloodlines do not stay conveniently within palace walls. Heward looked at him for a moment, with the expression of a man assembling a more complicated question. "Your Majesty," he said slowly, "is there any other reason, beyond the bloodmark, that you intervened personally in this execution?" The room was very quiet. Cain looked at him steadily. "Yes," he said. He had decided, the night before, that partial truths were going to be worse than full ones in the long run. He had sat in his study with a glass of wine and worked through the variables the way he worked through everything, and he had arrived at the same conclusion from multiple directions. The court would find out. The court always found out. If he built a version of events that had to be maintained and it collapsed, the collapse would be far more damaging than the truth told plainly. "The woman," he said, "is carrying my child." The silence this time was of a different quality. Lady Voss went very still. Heward's face did several things in rapid succession. "The circumstances," Cain said, before anyone could speak, "are not what they will appear. I will explain them in full to the council. But I want it clearly understood before I do that the woman in question acted with complete integrity throughout, and that the circumstances that placed her in a dungeon cell for 11 days are a failure of our border intelligence process, not any fault of hers. I signed that death warrant without adequate information. That is on me. It will not happen again." Another silence. "She is the mother of your heir," Voss said quietly. "She is carrying my child," Cain said. "What she is beyond that has not yet been determined. That is also a conversation for the council. But she is not a prisoner, and she is not a spy, and she will be treated with the respect that situation requires. If anyone in this court fails to do that, they will answer to me personally. Is that clear?" It was clear. It was very clear. The council spent the next 2 hours going through everything, and Cain told them the version that was true, which he had found, over the years, to be less complicated to maintain than any other kind. When they were done, and the council had filed out with the particular silence of people who had a great deal to process, Lady Voss paused at the door. "She did not tell anyone," Voss said quietly. "In 11 days. "No," Cain said. "She protected the child's existence, even when it might have saved her." "Yes." Voss looked at him for a moment with those sharp, evaluating eyes. "She sounds," she said carefully, "like someone worth knowing." She left before he could respond. He sat in the empty council chamber with the dying fire, and thought about 2 hours in a cold stone room, with a woman who had looked at him without fear or calculation, and told him the truth, plainly, and without performance, and he thought about what she had said. I was not going to use this as a position. He had known a great many people who would have. He did not spend the rest of the evening thinking about her. He had documents to sign, and reports to review, and a kingdom that did not pause for personal complications. But when he finally went to sleep, he dreamed about a storm, and firelight, and careful hands. If you are still here, do not stop now. The most important part of the story is still ahead, and it will change everything you think you know about Elara, and what she has been carrying. Subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. This is only the beginning. Chapter 8. She had been in the East Wing for 5 days when he came to find her. Not a summons. Not a guard at the door with a formal request. He knocked himself, which was apparently not something he usually did. because Marta's expression when she opened the door and saw who was standing in the corridor carried precisely the kind of professional composure that is deployed to cover complete astonishment. "Your Majesty," Marta said. "I will come back if this is a poor time," he said, which was the kind of thing people said when they were not actually going to come back. "I will let her know you are here," Marta said, and withdrew. Elara was by the window. She spent a great deal of time by the window, because the east wing had a long view over the palace grounds toward the mountains, and the mountains were where she was from, and looking at them helped. She heard the knock and Marta's voice, and turned. He was standing in the doorway. She had not seen him since the stone antechamber. He had sent Marta with updated information, and better food, and a message that she was free to move within the east wing and the garden below it, and she had been waiting for whatever came next, with the patience she had developed in the dungeon, which was more patience than she had thought she possessed. "The garden," he said, "if you are willing." She was willing. They walked in the garden below the east wing, which was a contained space with stone walls and winter roses that were somehow still growing despite the cold, and their breath made small clouds in the air, and the ground was slightly frozen underfoot. He walked beside her with his hands behind his back and said nothing for a while, which she found did not bother her. She had never required conversation to fill silence. It was one of the things that had worked well between them in the way station, she thought, though she had not framed it in those terms at the time. "I told the council," he said. "I know," she said. "Marta has her sources." That almost not quite amusement again. "What did they say?" she asked. "What councils always say," he said, which is a great deal, in carefully measured language, with political implication layered under every sentence. The actual substance was that they require a plan and a timeline and a formal arrangement. "A formal arrangement," she said. "The child's status needs to be established. If this child is my heir, which is a biological certainty, then their position needs to be formalized before their birth. That is not negotiable from a succession standpoint." She stopped walking. He stopped beside her. The winter roses were very red against the gray stone wall. "What are you asking me?" she said. He turned to look at her, and she saw him choose his words with the same careful precision she had seen him apply to everything. "I am asking you," he said, "whether you are willing to consider a formal arrangement. I am not asking you for an answer today. I am asking you whether it is something you are willing to consider." She looked at him. This was the moment she had built walls against. This was the moment she had told herself, over and over in the dark, would not happen, or would not be real, or would be a political maneuver dressed in human clothing. Looking at him now, in the winter garden with the red roses and the cold air, and his careful words, she could not entirely frame it as any of those things. "Tell me," she said, "what you want. Not what the council wants, not what the succession requires. What you want." A silence. He was looking at the mountains. "I want," he said slowly, "the same thing I have wanted since I woke up in a ruined way station and found that the woman who had saved my life was gone. I want to know who you are. Not the bloodmark, not the political situation. You." She looked at his profile and thought about 11 days in a dungeon cell, and the word "stop" falling across a public square, like a stone, and 2 hours of honest questions in a cold room. "That," she said, "I can work with." He looked at her then, She met his eyes. The wind came down from the mountains, carrying cold and snow and the distant smell of pine forests and high passes, and it was familiar in her bones, in a way that the palace was not yet, and might take a long time to become. But she was good at surviving things that took a long time. She was, in fact, very good at it. Chapter 9. The bloodmark changed things in ways she had not anticipated. Aldrich came to see her on her 6th day in the East Wing, with the particular manner of someone doing something they had decided was important, but were not entirely sure they had the right to do. He was old in the way of people who had been strong for so long, that the strength was still there underneath the age, visible in the way he moved and held himself. He sat across from her in the East Wing sitting room, and Marta brought tea, and he looked at her neck for a long moment before looking at her face. "You know what it is," he said. "I know more than I did a week ago," she said. He nodded slowly. "There are things I should tell you," he said. "Things that were kept out of the official histories. The founding king's youngest son, the one the records say died without heir, did not die without heir." She set down her tea. "He had a daughter," Aldrich said. "The circumstances were complicated. A mate outside the nobility. A child raised away from the palace, far from the court, in the border territories. The king's decision to send them away was not made with cruelty, but the effect was the same. The line continued but never returned. Until now," she said. "Until now," he agreed. He looked at her face with those steady old eyes. "You are not simply a woman who was caught in a storm, child. You are the last of the founding bloodline. That is not a small thing." She was quiet for a moment. "What does it mean practically," she said, "for someone who grew up running courier routes in the Highlands?" He looked at her with something that took her a moment to recognize. It was respect. "It means," he said, "that the child you are carrying is not just the Alpha King's heir. The child carries 2 bloodlines, the ruling line through the father and the founding line through the mother." He paused. "That has not happened in the history of this kingdom." She thought about this. She thought about her mother, who had been quiet and capable, and had a mark on her throat she had always covered with a high collar, and had never explained. She thought about her grandmother, who had died when Elara was very young, who had lived at the farthest edge of the Greyford settlements, in a house with walls so thick it was almost a fortress, and who had looked at Elara sometimes with an expression she had never understood. "My mother knew," she said quietly. "Very likely," Aldrich said. "The families that carried the bloodmark in exile knew what it was, and kept it quiet for their protection. Your family chose survival over recognition. That was not a wrong choice." "No," she said. "It wasn't." She looked at the window and the mountains beyond. "Does he know all of this?" she said. "I told him this morning," Aldrich said. "He asked me to come to you as well. He thought it should come from someone who knew the history, rather than from him." She turned this over. He had thought about how she would receive the information. He had thought about what would make it easier to hear. She added this to the accumulation of things she was noticing about him, which was becoming a fairly significant collection. "Thank you," she said. Aldrich stood, paused at the door with the look of a man who had one more thing to say. "He stopped that execution," he said, "before he knew about the child, before he had time to think or plan or calculate. He said one word in a public square, in front of 100 witnesses. That was the wolf acting, not the king. He looked at her steadily. "I thought you should know the difference." He left. Marta reappeared from whatever shadow she had been occupying, collected the teacups with serene efficiency, and said nothing. Elara sat for a long time by the window. He stopped that execution before he knew about the child. She had been building a careful internal structure around this situation, reinforcing the walls of her own autonomy, keeping the accounting clear. She had been telling herself, he is acting from duty, from succession, from the requirements of a throne that needs an heir. This is not personal. This is political. She had been building the walls because the walls were safer. But the wolf had acted. Before the child. Before the mark was fully confirmed. Before any of the practical considerations were on the table. The wolf had acted on scent alone. She pressed her hand flat against her stomach and felt the child that was not yet visible to anyone but Marta. And she thought about a storm and firelight and careful hands and a man who had said I did not forget that night. She had not forgotten either. That, she thought, was probably relevant information. Chapter 10. The court came to its own conclusions, as courts did. In the absence of an official statement, which was something Cain was taking his time producing, the collective intelligence of the palace decided on several competing theories and distributed them across the gossip channels simultaneously. Elara tracked them through Marta, who reported with the air of a naturalist documenting species behavior. Theory 1 was that she was an intelligence asset who had been turned from the Ashvin network and was now providing information in exchange for her life. This theory was popular among the military-adjacent members of court, who liked their narratives to be strategically coherent. Theory 2 was that she was a political bride from a connected family, being installed quietly before a formal announcement. This theory was popular among the marriage-obsessed section of court, who liked their narratives to be romantically adjacent. Theory 3 was that she was a witch who had used magic in the square to stop the Alpha King's will, which was popular among the people who found the first two theories insufficiently dramatic. None of them, as far as she could tell, had arrived at the actual truth. She found this oddly reassuring. It meant that when the truth did emerge, and it would emerge, she had no illusions about that. It would be sufficiently surprising that people would be busy reacting to it, rather than claiming to have already known. She occupied her days in the East Wing with the discipline that had kept her functional through harder things than this. She walked the garden. She read from the palace library that Marta had quietly communicated was available to her. She ate regularly, which was important. She slept enough, which took effort. On the 8th day, he came back to the garden. She had been there for an hour already, in the weakened winter sun with her cloak pulled close, and she heard his footsteps on the gravel before she saw him. "The midwife is on her way," he said, coming to stand beside her. She looked at him. Seren. Yes, she was still in the valley settlements. She will be here in 2 days. She had not expected this to be something he followed through on specifically. She had mentioned Seren once, in the stone antechamber, and she had not mentioned it again, because there had been larger things to discuss, and she had not wanted to seem to be making requests. He had remembered. He had sent for Seren without being asked a second time. "Thank you," she said. He stood beside her looking at the winter roses with his hands behind his back, the posture she was coming to associate with him when he was thinking about something he had not finished thinking about. The formal arrangement he said. She waited. I want to be precise about what I am proposing, he said, not because I wish to make it a transaction, but because I have found that precision prevents misunderstanding, and misunderstanding tends to cause damage. All right, she said. He turned to look at her. I am proposing, he said, that we spend the time before a formal decision is made, learning whether this can be more than a political necessity. I am not asking you to commit to anything you are not certain of. I am not asking you to perform a role for the court. I am asking you whether you are willing to consider. She looked at him. You are very careful with your words, she said. Yes, he said. It is a habit. So am I, she said. Usually. I am less careful when I am tired, which is fairly often at the moment. Is that a yes? She looked at the mountains over the wall and thought about all the walls she had built, and all the walls that had been built around her, and the wind that kept coming down from the north, with the smell of home in it. Yes, she said. It is a yes. He exhaled, which she would not have noticed if she had not been paying close attention. But she was. Good, he said. They stood in the winter garden, with the red roses and the cold air, and the mountains in the distance, and it was not yet anything that had a name, and it was not yet finished being built. But it was real. She was sure of that. Chapter 11. Serene arrived 2 days later, as promised. She was exactly as Elara remembered her. Compact, efficient, with gray, streaked hair, and hands that inspected things with the authority of someone who had delivered more than 1,000 children, and been surprised by almost none of it. She came into the East Wing sitting room, and looked at Elara and said, You look thin. You have been eating? Regularly, Elara said. Good. She sat down, set her bag beside her, and looked at Elara with sharp, dark eyes. Tell me everything from the beginning. Elara told her everything from the beginning, which took a while. Seren listened with the total attention that was her particular professional gift, asking precise questions at precise intervals, not expressing surprise or judgment at any point, including the Alpha King, the dungeon, or the execution. You are healthy, Seren said, when the examination was complete. The child is healthy. You are roughly 10 weeks along, which matches your account. The pregnancy is proceeding normally, as far as I can determine. She paused. You are also under significant stress, which is not ideal, but which I note you are managing with an admirable degree of practical competence. Thank you, Elara said. I am not sure it was entirely a compliment, Seren said dryly. You should be allowing yourself to feel things, rather than managing them. I feel things, Elara said. When? At night, when no one can see. Seren looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not unkind. He sent for me, she said. The king. Did you know he sent the message himself, not through an intermediary? Elara looked at her. Specific instructions, Seren said. The finest rooms. Access to the palace library for whatever medical texts I required. Anything Elara needs from you, he wrote. Anything at all. Underlined. A silence. He underlined it, Elara said. Twice, Seren said. Elara looked at the window. She did not say anything. She was busy feeling something, which she managed to do even when it was daytime, apparently. He came to see me this morning, Seren said, before he sent me to you. He asked me to tell him what to expect. Medically. He wanted to know how to look for signs that you needed more support. He asked about what to avoid saying, because he said he was aware that his instinct for precision could sometimes land as coldness, and he wanted to know if that was something I had found affected mothers, in early pregnancy. Elara turned to look at her. "He said that," she said. "Verbatim, more or less," Seren said. She was looking at Elara with the calm of someone who had seen a great many stories begin, and knew how to recognize the ones that were going somewhere. "He is very thorough," Elara said, and her voice came out slightly uneven. "Yes," Seren said. "He is." A pause. "Are you all right?" Seren said. Elara thought about 11 days in the dark. A death warrant. A word spoken in a public square. A winter garden and precise, careful words. And a man who asked a midwife how not to cause her distress. "Yes," she said. "I am beginning to think I might be." Chapter 12. The official announcement came on the 14th day. Cain composed it himself, which his secretary noted was unusual, and then said nothing further about. He wrote 3 drafts, discarded 2, and read the 3rd to Elara in the East Wing sitting room before it was released, which was not protocol, and which he was doing anyway. She listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "You included the dungeon." "Yes," he said. "You did not have to." "I told you I would tell the truth," he said. "The truth includes the dungeon. If the court is going to have a view on this situation, they should have an accurate view." She looked at him. "There will be people," she said, "who decide this reflects badly on you. A king who signed a death warrant for the woman carrying his heir." "Yes," he said. "You are not concerned." "I am more concerned about the version where I omit it, and it emerges later," he said. "Which it would. It always does." He looked at her. "And I am more concerned about the version where you walk into the court of this kingdom, with a story that begins with your word, against an official record. You deserve the official record to tell the truth." She looked at him for a long moment. There was something, she had come to notice, in the way he thought about her. Not about the situation, not about the child, not about the political requirements, but specifically about her, about what she deserved, about what would be fair and what would not. It was quiet. It was not performed for her or for anyone else. It was simply there, in the decisions he made without announcing them. She had not expected it. She had expected competence and duty, and the cold precision of a man who ran a kingdom, and had long since put personal considerations in their appropriate box. She was revising her expectations. "All right," she said. The announcement was released that afternoon. The response was considerable. She sat in the East Wing with Serene and Marta, and listened to the sounds of the palace adjusting to new information, which had a particular quality, a kind of pressurized murmur, like water finding new channels, moving through the corridors and chambers and staircases, and finding its level. By evening, Lady Voss sent a note, delivered by a page who looked very carefully at his feet the whole time. The note said, "I would like to call on you tomorrow, if you are willing. Not in any official capacity, simply to meet you." Elara considered it. She wrote back, "Yes, come in the morning." Marta collected the note and dispatched the page, and came back with the expression of someone who thought this was the right decision. "She is the most important person on the council to have on your side," Marta said. "I know," Elara said. "You knew that already," Marta said, sounding slightly surprised. "I have been listening," Elara said. "Listening is usually how you find out who matters." Marta looked at her with those walnut-bright eyes, and said, in a tone that was as close to warm as her professional manner ever got, "You are going to be fine." Elara looked at the window, and the mountains, and the last of the winter light, going off the snow on the distant peaks. Yes, she said, I think I am. Chapter 13. She met Lady Voss in the East Wing sitting room over tea, on a grey winter morning, with snow beginning to fall. Voss was younger than Elara had imagined from the reports, barely 30, with the particular sharpness of a woman who had been underestimated often enough to find it useful. She came in without ceremony, and sat across from Elara, and looked at her with frank curiosity that was not quite what Elara had expected from a court official. I want to be useful to you, Voss said, without preamble. Not as a political ally, though that is also available if you want it. I mean practically. You are about to navigate a court that has strong and complicated feelings about what happened, and you are going to do it without any of the preparation that people in your position usually have. I have been in this court for 8 years. I can tell you things that will help. Elara looked at her. Why? She said. Voss considered. Because the king told the truth in that council chamber, which he did not have to do, and which most advisers, including myself, did not expect him to do. Because the announcement included the dungeon, which means either he is very confident, or he is prioritizing honesty over optics, and in my experience those two things are usually mutually exclusive. She paused. And because you have been in the East Wing for 14 days, without making any demands, any requests for status, any attempts to leverage your situation, that is unusual. I told him I was not going to use this as a position, Elara said. Yes, Voss said. He told me. A pause. He told me quite a lot about you, actually. More than I have heard him say about any person in 8 years. A silence. What did he say? Elara asked, and hated slightly that she was asking. Voss's mouth curved, not unkindly. That you were practical, she said. That you were honest. That you had carried a significant secret in a circumstance where using it would have been obvious, and you had not. A pause. And that you dragged him out of a collapsed building in a blizzard with your bare hands. He was heavy, Elara said. Voss laughed. A real laugh. Brief and genuine. I imagine he was, she said. They drank their tea, and Voss told her things about the court, and Elara listened the way she always listened, carefully and completely, filing and sorting, building the map she would need for the territory ahead. When Voss left, she turned at the door. One more thing, she said. He has not smiled in front of the council in 8 years. Not once. Not at good news or victory or anything. She looked at Elara steadily. He smiled yesterday, when the morning report from the East Wing said you had asked for a second set of books from the library. Elara said nothing. Just thought you should know, Voss said, and left. Elara sat in the East Wing sitting room with the snow falling outside, and the fire burning steady, and her hand on her stomach, and thought about a man who had signed her death warrant, and stopped her execution, and told the truth to a council that had not expected it, and sent for a midwife with his own hand, and underlined a sentence twice. She thought about what a person was, underneath the throne and the title, and the precise, careful words. She thought about firelight, and a storm, and hands that had been careful and grateful, and had not asked anything at all. She thought about a garden, and red roses, and the word yes. She had been very sure, for a very long time, that the walls were the safest thing she had. She was beginning to wonder. Chapter 14. The snow fell for 3 days. on the second day of snow, he came to the east wing in the evening and knocked on the door himself and said, "I have no particular purpose for being here. I thought I would ask if you wanted company." She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "Come in." They sat by the fire. Marta brought tea and disappeared with the efficiency of someone who understood the room perfectly. Seren was in the adjoining chamber, working on something, visible through the half-open door, as a quiet background presence. He sat across from her with his tea and looked at the fire, and she looked at the fire too, and they did not speak immediately, which was comfortable in the same way it had been comfortable in the way station, the particular ease of two people who did not require noise from each other. "Tell me about the settlements," he said, after a while. She did. She told him about the Greyford Highlands in spring, when the ice came off the mountain passes, and the trading routes opened, and the whole network came alive with movement and exchange. She told him about the long winter nights, when the clans gathered and the storytellers came out, the old histories and the new ones, the way the stories changed slightly with each telling, and how the changes were themselves information about what had happened in the year between. She told him about her mother's garden, which had been stubbornly productive in the worst soil in the region, because her mother had refused to accept anything less than productivity from the things she tended. She told him about the courier routes, and the passes, and the places where you could camp in a storm and survive, versus the places that looked sheltered but were death traps, and why the difference mattered, and how she had learned it. He listened to all of it. He asked questions that were not the questions of a king cataloging a border territory. They were the questions of someone who wanted to understand a place through the experience of a person who had lived there, the particular texture of it, the things that made it specific and real, rather than strategic and abstract. She answered them. At some point the fire burned lower, and Marta quietly added wood, and neither of them acknowledged this. "Tell me about the storm," she said, when there was a pause. He was quiet for a moment. "I had been riding for 2 days," he said. "There was a situation in the Northern Territories that I had been trying to think through. I do that sometimes. Ride until the problem resolves." He looked at the fire. "The storm came up faster than I had expected. I made it to the way station, and the wall came down before I had been inside an hour." "I found you under the second beam," she said. "I know," he said. "I woke up once while you were still moving debris. I remember your face. You were not frightened." "I was focused," she said. "Yes," he said. "That is different." A pause. "I woke in the morning, and you were gone," he said. "I did not understand it at first. I thought something had happened to you. I went outside, and the storm was gone, and the road was clear, and your tracks went south." He paused. "I followed them for half a mile before I turned back." She looked at him. "You were going south," he said. "You had a direction. I did not have a right to take that from you." She was quiet. "But you looked for me afterward," she said. "Yes," he said. "I did." She thought about a border settlement patrol, the journey south that had ended in a dungeon cell, the version of events in which she had made it to Seren's Valley, and had the child in a small, warm house, with familiar hands around her, instead of iron bars. Both paths had arrived here. She thought that was probably significant, in the way that things you could not have planned were significant. "I am glad you stopped the execution," she said. He looked at her. "I was afraid you might have died not knowing," she said. "And I thought that would have been Wrong. For you not to know. Yes, he said quietly. It would have been. The fire burned. The snow fell. They sat in the east wing with the warmth and the quiet, and all the unmapped territory still ahead of them. And it was not finished. And it was not simple. And it was not yet anything that had been decided. But it was real. It had always been real. From the moment the storm changed, and the scent reached him across a public square, and he had said one word before he had time to be anything other than honest. It had been real from the beginning. Chapter 15. The spring came late to Arkenfall that year. It arrived the way it always arrived in the Northern Territories. Not all at once, but in installments. A day of warmth followed by a week of frost, the ice pulling back from the passes like a tide that couldn't decide whether it was going in or out. Elara noticed the spring more than she had noticed any spring before, because she had spent the winter noticing everything, carefully and completely, with the particular attention of someone who understood that this time was temporary, and that it was building toward something she could not yet see the full shape of. She was 5 months along. The child was visible now, warmly and unmistakably present, and Seren had moved into the East Wing entirely because traveling back to the valley every few weeks had been declared impractical by Cain, with the thorough organizational certainty he applied to everything he decided. Seren had accepted this with equanimity and had taken over the East Wing library alcove as her working space, which Elara thought suited both of them. The court had settled. Not unanimously, not without continued pockets of disapproval and competitive narrative building, but the general consensus had moved from active disruption to watchful adjustment, which was the most she could reasonably expect from people who had had their assumptions substantially reorganized. Voss had been useful beyond her early promises. She had navigated the social landscape of the court with the precision of a woman who understood it thoroughly and handled it without contempt, introducing Elara to the people who mattered in ways that allowed both parties to assess each other honestly, without performance. Elara had found, to her own slight surprise, that she was good at this. She had been moving between territories and cultures her whole life. The court was a different kind of territory, but the skills transferred. Aldrich came to see her most mornings, which had evolved from formal visits to something that resembled, without either of them naming it as such, the visits of an elderly family member who had decided to be present. He told her the old histories. He told her about the founding line and the exile and the generations that had carried the mark in the border territories, and she listened to the story of her own family, unfolding backward through time like a river running toward its source. She told him about her mother's garden and her grandmother's fortress house, and the mark that had been covered and never explained. He told her that her grandmother's name had been Mira, and that Mira had been the granddaughter of a woman who had left the palace at 19, with a traitor from the Highlands, following a love story that the official histories had recorded as a death, and a different story had remembered as an elopement. She thought about the mark on her throat, and the choices that had been made for generations to keep it safe and quiet, and the long chain of consequence that had brought her to a way station in a blizzard at exactly the moment a king was buried under a collapsed wall. She thought about the word coincidence, and decided it was insufficient. She sat in the garden with the first real warmth of spring on her face, and her hand on her stomach, and she felt the child move for the first time, a small, unmistakable flutter, nothing like what she had imagined, something entirely specific and real, and she caught her breath. "There you are," she said quietly. "Not to anyone. Or perhaps to the child. Or perhaps to the spring. Or perhaps to the version of herself that had kept going through the dark and the cold and the road and the dungeon and had not stopped. Not quite. Not all the way." The door from the palace opened behind her. She heard his footsteps on the gravel, familiar now in the way that sounds became familiar when you paid attention. "The first real warm day," he said, coming to stand beside her. "Yes," she said. He sat down on the bench next to her. The garden was bright and cold, and the roses were beginning to show the first red suggestions of buds. "She moved," Elara said, "just now, for the first time." He went very still. She looked at him. His face had done something she had not seen it do before. The control had not dropped, but it had become transparent, the way ice became transparent in certain light, so that you could see everything underneath without the surface being gone. "Yes," she said quietly. He looked at her hand on her stomach. She took his hand and placed it flat beside hers, without thinking about it, without the careful, deliberate consideration she had been applying to everything. He was very still. Then the child moved again. Elara watched his face. He said nothing. He did not need to. Some things were not precision's territory. Some things lived in the space before words, where choices happened before they were known as choices, where the wolf moved and the heart moved, and the careful control of a long rein was simply not enough to hold it in. His hand was warm. The spring was coming. The child was there. She thought about all the walls she had built, brick by careful brick, in the dark and on the road, and in the dungeon, and in this palace. And she thought about the word real. It was all real. All of it. Every choice that had led here, including the choices she had made against herself, out of fear, out of the habit of covering the mark, and keeping moving and not asking for things and not saying what she knew. Even those. Because they had led here. To a winter garden becoming spring, and a warm hand, and a child moving for the first time. She had not been afraid, in the square, with the sword at its arc. She had not known then what she knew now. Now she knew what she had been moving toward, through all of it, without knowing. She knew what the stillness had been, not resignation, but patience. Not the absence of hope, but hope's most honest form, which does not announce itself but simply keeps the door open. She kept the door open. She had always kept it open. "I know what I want," she said quietly, "in case you were still waiting to know." He looked at her. She met his eyes. "I want this," she said, "the real version of it, not the arrangement, not the political necessity. I want to know who you are. I want you to know who I am. I want to raise this child in a place where the mark is not hidden, and the story is not covered, and the choices are honest ones." She paused. "I am not afraid," she said. "I was not afraid in the square. I am not afraid now. I want you to know that. Whatever happens from here, I am not doing it from fear." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "Neither am I." The winter roses were still red against the stone wall. The first green of spring was coming through the frozen ground. The child moved, and it was enough. It was, in fact, everything. If you watched until the end, you are exactly the kind of person this story was made for. Subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. New stories every week. And if this one stayed with you, share it with someone who needs a story that holds on until the last second. The end.